Hey, what's going on YouTube? Or Storm here with another video today. I apologize for the bad upload thing I used. I used some old software that unfortunately has had issues for me lately. We will not have that issue again, but anyway, I'll be reposting the Tele-DAD deck profile. So as I did in the video, I'll go over a brief explanation as to what Tele-DAD is and like why it was such a notorious deck. So Tele-DAD is short for Emergency Teleport Dark Arm Dragon, which essentially was a deck I believe that was mostly used in the 2009 era of Yu-Gi-Oh! This deck was notorious for two reasons. One, the main reason it was notorious was that it ended up actually causing an emergency ban list. Cards like Destiny Draw and I believe Allure of Darkness were hit on the list during this era, because during this era it was a 6-month ban list format. So emergency land ban lists were a lot more common than they are today because we have a ban list every 3 months. So the fact that the deck was so good that it caused an emergency ban list was pretty unprecedented for the era during that time. The other reason this deck was notorious was it was prohibitively expensive. Like, for example, one copy of Dark Arm Dragon would cost you more than a playset of Dante's would nowadays. So it kind of gives you the idea of how expensive this deck was. I mean, just to compete, you would have to drop well over $200 just to get like one card. So it was notorious for that reason as well, that there was usually people walking around with $1,000 decks. Like it was stupidly expensive. But anyway, the history lesson out of the way, let's get to the deck profile. So first off, we have 3 copies of Destiny Hero Malicious. This is basically your primary synchro target. You're going to be using this to get out your level 8s, which are probably the most common synchros you're going to be making in a Tele-DAD deck. 1 copy of Diamond Dude, mostly to fill out, make sure you have at least 4 copies for Stratos. You want to have, I like to always, we don't really need more than 1 copy of Diamond Dude because you're not really going to use him that often. 1 copy of Elemental Hero Stratos. Stratos was one of the main reasons, he was one of the key cogs in this deck because he would search out your Mallies and your Diamond Dudes to set up your D-draw plays. So it was a pretty powerful card for this deck, and one of the reasons this deck was really good. Then 1 copy of Sandgan, your primary searcher, searches out your Krebons, your Plagues, your Armageddon Knights. Basically, it's one of the best search cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, and it was legal during this format and for quite a bit long after that. Then 3 copies of Krebons. I know I run 3 copies of E-Tele, but it's because I want to get to my Krebons as early as possible. If you feel the need to run other Psychic-type targets for E-Tele, Psychic Commander is a good option. Plus, it does open up Black Rose Dragon plays if you feel that you like that type of card. 2 copies of Dark Grepher. This is mostly to get your Mallies in the graveyard and Plagues as early in the graveyard as early as possible. That's why it's in here. Speaking of which, 1 copy of Plague Spreader Zombie. I don't feel that it's really necessary at more than 1. If you feel it is, like no more than 2 is really necessary. Like, you're not going to really be using the effect that often, and most of the time you're going to be synchroing with your Krebons anyways. And 2 copies of Armageddon Knight for the same reason as Grepher, to get our Mallies in the graveyard as early as possible. So that's one of the reasons it's really nice. And then 2 copies of Dark Arm Dragon, the star of the deck. He's been at 1 for quite a long time, and this deck is one of the reasons why. So basically it's like, even nowadays people are surprised to see a Dark Arm Dragon hit the board. It's a really powerful card. And then 1 copy of Spirit Reaper, because during this era, their battle was a pretty important part of the game, and getting over a Spirit Reaper wasn't exactly easy with the forms of removal that were legal during this format. So outside of making something like Red Dragon Archfiend, getting over a Spirit Reaper was a pain in the butt. That's all the monster lineup for these spells. 1 copy of Monster Reborn. Why not run it? It was legal during this format, and even today it would still be just an incredibly powerful top deck if it was legal, but it's probably going to sit on the ban list for quite some time. 3 copies of Allure. This deck, I believe, like I said, Allure was hit to semi-limited because of this deck and an emergency ban list, and this deck is one of the reasons why this card is going to be at 1, was hit to 1, and it's probably going to be at 1 almost forever in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because dark decks are always going to be powerful, and I feel like at 1 it's a pretty solid number. 3 copies of E-Tele. Like I said, I mean, if you don't like the 3-to-3 ratio, you could run maybe a couple copies of Psychic Commander if you so wish. 2 copies of D-Draw, because I think Destiny Draw is one of those cards that can clog a bit when it's at 3, especially when you're running 4 targets. I know you can Rota out a Diamond do the ditch it with the Yugioh, but I just feel that 2 is the ideal number, to be honest. 2 copies of Reinforcement of the Army, because it was semi-limited during this format. Searches out your Greffers, your Armageddon Knights, your Diamond Dudes, even your Stratos, so why not run it? Then for the last couple 1-0s, 1 Heavy Storm, obvious reasons. Another thing you have to think about when you're playing Tele-DAD is that Heavy Storm is legal, so you have to be very careful about overextending on your back row. 1 copy of Brain Control, because it's basically was the Snatch Steal this era, except you just paid 500 life points. It was basically like Mind Control without the restrictions. Then 1 copy of Giant Trunade, because bouncing. Why not bounce all your opponents, return all spell and trap cards in the field to hand, and then force your opponent to have to reset it. So most of the time you would use Giant Trunade. You would use Trunade to clear the field of spell and traps, then push for game. So if this thing hit the board, it basically meant that your opponent was pushing for game. 2 copies of Royal Oppression. This was basically like the Vanity's Emptiness of the Tele-DAD era. And one of the reasons this card was hit to 1 and then banned, much like Emptiness has recently been hit to 1. One of the reasons was this card called Magical Android would continue to give you life points every end phase. So it created a lock where you'd barely be paying any life points and you'd have an established board, and your opponent really couldn't respond, especially if you put an Android on the field, and unlike Emptiness, getting rid of Oppression without something like Heavy or MST was pretty difficult. Then 1 copy of Crush Card Virus, because it was legal during this format. People would play cards like, DD Crow, and in this deck you've got a Sangan and Plague are targets for it, as well as Spirit Reaper, so why not run it? 3 copies of Solemn Judgment, because it was at 3 during this format. Why not run it at 3? And 3 copies of Reckless Greed to get us to our combo pieces a bit quicker. Now for the extra deck, even though this deck was during a 5Ds era, this was when a lot of the extra deck was actually cut down to 15. But even in Tele-DAD, there really wasn't a ton of... The extra decks were kind of standardized across the board. If you ran a Psychic Commander, you could run Black Rose Dragon, but this is pretty standard Tele-DAD extra deck. 3 copies of Stardust Dragon. Stardust was pretty difficult to deal with during this format, even though there were cards like Dark Arm Dragon. Getting over a Stardust when you couldn't, blow anything up and it would just negate it. So it was a really difficult card to deal with. Then 3 copies of Red Dragon Archfiend, because a lot of times during Tele-DAD, people would start going defensive, and that's when Red Dragon Archfiend just gets at its best. When your opponent's throwing up a defensive wall of monsters, this card will just nuke all of them. The reason it doesn't see much play nowadays is because that last bit of clause where if you have a monster that doesn't declare an attack, it gets destroyed. But so that's one of the reasons this card, even though it's arguably one of the attack-wise, it's one of the beefiest level 8 synchro monsters, but that's why it doesn't see play nowadays. 2 copies of Thought Ruler Archfiend, because if we're running, cards that have heavy cost payments like Royal Oppression and Judgment, why would we not Thought Ruler and get those some life points? It can also protect itself as well as your Krebons and other psychic type monsters from being targeted by spells or traps, which is nice. 3 copies of Yugioh Guardian. This deck was one of the reasons Yugioh was hit during this era mostly because there were so many synchro monsters you could just steal from your opponent, and the fact that 2800 was beefier than both Thought Ruler and Stardust, which are the most popular synchros during this era. That's one of the reasons Yugioh was so powerful, because it was stronger than most of the big synchros during this time period. So even though nowadays it's not as good, in this deck it was just incredibly powerful. 1 copy of Magical Android, like I said previously, is to set up the Royal Oppression lock. You don't really need more than 1 copy, because the times you're going to actually make it are pretty situational. And lastly, 3 copies of Colossal Fighter. Colossal Fighter was pretty powerful in Tele-DAD because there's so many warriors. I mean, you've got 5, 7, you've got I believe 9 total warrior monsters. And in fact, if your opponent's playing Tele-DAD, they're going to have a ton of warriors. So this card can get pretty dang beefy. And it's just a really strong synchro monster. I mean, even nowadays, it's still a pretty powerful card provided for some decks to get, and it's difficult for some decks to get over. So anyway, guys, thank you for watching this video today. Really appreciate it when people watch my videos. Tune in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Fridays for more Yu-Gi-Oh content. Also follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/AuraStorm43. And if you like what you saw from this video, please subscribe. This is Aura Storm signing out.